At the family dinner, the table was filled with the smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh bread, but the air was heavy with tension. Plates clinked, voices murmured, and then Marjorie, the woman who had called herself his stepmother for years, slammed her fork down so hard the sound cut through the room. Her eyes narrowed, sharp and cold, and she hissed, "Stay home, you useless." The words stung more than he thought they could. Ethan froze, his chest tight, his face hot as though the whole world was staring at him. His fork hovered above his plate, hand trembling slightly, but he forced himself not to show weakness. His cousin stopped chewing, his aunt lowered her glass, and the room went quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. He wanted to shout back, to spill every word he had swallowed over the years, but something stronger held him still. Instead of giving her the satisfaction of an outburst, he leaned back in his chair. Slowly, deliberately, he brought his hands together and clapped, once, twice, 3 times, each sound echoing in the silence. His eyes stayed fixed on Marjorie's face, watching her smirk falter. Then Ethan stood up, chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and final. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't look at his father. He didn't give anyone the chance to stop him. He just walked away from the table, the weight of every stare on his back. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, and for the first time, the silence belonged to him. Ethan's earliest memories were of his mother's warm laugh, the way she tucked him in at night, the songs she hummed when she cooked. But those moments ended too soon. When he was only 8, his world shifted. His mother passed away, and the house that once felt safe turned hollow and strained. His father, Gerald, didn't know how to handle the grief. Within a year, he brought another woman into their lives, and Ethan had to learn how to live under Marjorie's roof. Marjorie came in smiling, presenting herself as someone who wanted to build a family, but behind closed doors, Ethan saw her true nature. She had a son, Travis, a boy only a year younger than Ethan. From the beginning, it was clear who she favored. Travis had new clothes, toys, and every opportunity she could give him, while Ethan was left to figure things out on his own. The small kindnesses he hoped for never came. If Ethan needed shoes, he was told to make do with the worn-out pair he already had. If Travis wanted the latest sneakers, they appeared within days. It didn't take long before Ethan realized he was seen as an outsider in his own home. Marjorie's words always carried an edge, reminding him that he wasn't hers. "You're lucky your father even keeps you here," she would say when he tried to stand up for himself. The message was always the same. He was less than her son, less than anyone. As Ethan grew older, he didn't sit idle. He picked up jobs after school, mowing lawns, washing cars, stocking shelves at the grocery store. He gave most of what he earned to help with bills, hoping it would ease the tension, maybe earn some respect. But instead of gratitude, he was met with sneers. "Don't think a few dollars make you important," Marjorie would mutter, making sure Travis was nearby to hear. Gerald stayed silent. He rarely defended his son, too weary or too unwilling to challenge his wife. Ethan learned to stop looking to his father for protection. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place he had to survive in. Travis, emboldened by his mother's favoritism, followed her lead. He mocked Ethan for working while he spent weekends with friends or playing video games. If Ethan came home tired, Travis would smirk and say, "What's the point? You'll always be nothing." And Marjorie never corrected him. In fact, she seemed proud that her son had learned to see Ethan the same way she did. The bitterness grew slowly, year by year. Ethan stayed quiet, but each insult carved deeper. Every time his stepmother dismissed his efforts, every time his father avoided his eyes, every time Travis laughed at his expense, it piled up inside him. The dinner confrontation wasn't just about one cruel remark. It was the result of years of being pushed down, of carrying the weight of a family that never wanted him to belong. By the time Marjorie slammed her fork down at that table, Ethan already knew he was standing on the edge of something final. Her words that night weren't new. They were simply the last straw. The years of being treated like an intruder had led to that single moment when he chose not to argue, not to explain, but to walk away. It wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of his escape. Ethan walked down the quiet street after leaving the dinner, the cool night air cutting against his face. His hands were shoved into his pockets, but his mind wasn't calm. Every step felt heavy, not from exhaustion but from the weight of years that pressed down on him. He replayed Marjorie's voice in his head, sharp and cruel, and though it wasn't the first time she had spoken to him that way, it echoed differently tonight. For the first time, he understood there was no future for him in that house. He thought about all the ways she had taken control over their lives. The house might have belonged to his father before she came, but it had long stopped feeling like his. Marjorie managed everything, the bank accounts, the groceries, even what was cooked on holidays. She decided who was invited for Thanksgiving, where they went for Christmas, and what traditions stayed or disappeared. Ethan remembered how she had quietly removed his mother's ornaments from the tree one year, packing them away without a word, as though his mother's memory didn't deserve a place in their lives. His father, Gerald, had once been strong. Ethan could still picture him teaching him to ride a bike, clapping when he took off without training wheels. But those memories felt like they belonged to another man. Now Gerald rarely spoke unless prompted, never lifting his voice when Marjorie cut Ethan down. Even at the dinner table tonight, when her words left the air so still you could hear forks scrape against plates, Gerald stared at his food, unable to look at his son. That silence was worse than anything Marjorie said. As Ethan kept walking, he realized how little space he had left in their world. There wasn't a room in that house where he truly belonged. The pictures on the walls were of Gerald, Marjorie, and Travis, smiling on vacations Ethan was never invited to. The meals were cooked to Travis's taste, the schedules arranged around him, the money funneled toward his wants. Ethan was a shadow in the background, tolerated but never accepted. It struck him that he had been holding on to the hope that things might change, that maybe one day his father would wake up and stand by him. But tonight proved that was never going to happen. Marjorie's grip was too tight, her control too complete. And his father's silence was its own kind of answer. If Gerald hadn't spoken up by now, he never would. Ethan stopped at the edge of the block, staring up at the dark sky. The thought came to him, quiet but steady. He couldn't go back. Not this time. Leaving the table wasn't just walking away from a meal. It was walking away from years of pain. If he stayed, he'd keep living in a place where his presence was treated as a mistake. If he left, he had a chance to shape something different, something his own. But he also knew one thing. He couldn't just disappear without leaving some kind of mark. Marjorie had worked too hard to erase him, and if he simply vanished, she would have won. He didn't want to scream at her or fight, but he couldn't leave quietly. He had to show her, and maybe even Gerald, that he wasn't useless. He had to prove that stepping away wasn't defeat. It was the start of something stronger. And as he turned toward the bus stop at the end of the street, Ethan decided he would never return to that house the same way again. That night, after the dinner that broke everything, Ethan didn't go back to his room. He walked straight past the house without looking at the windows, without checking if anyone noticed he hadn't returned. He knew if he stepped inside again, he would be pulled back into the same cycle. So he kept moving, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the determination that he was done. By the time he reached Caleb's place, the streets were quiet. Caleb had been his closest friend since high school, the kind of person who always had a spare blanket and never asked too many questions. When he opened the door and saw Ethan standing there, he didn't need an explanation. He just stepped aside and said, "Come in." Ethan dropped onto the couch, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind still sharp. For the first time, he admitted out loud how bad things had become. Caleb listened without interrupting, letting Ethan pour out years of frustration. When Ethan finished, his voice low and tired, Caleb leaned forward. "You've been their punching bag too long," he said firmly. "You can't keep living like that. Why not make something of yourself? And let them choke on their words later." The words struck something deep inside Ethan. He had always tried to survive quietly, never thinking beyond the walls of that house. But Caleb's voice opened a window he hadn't dared to look through. The idea of building something that couldn't be dismissed, something no one could take away, stuck with him. Later that night, lying awake on the couch, Ethan thought about his mother. Memories came in fragments. The way she braided his hair when it was too long, the way her hands smelled of flour when she baked, the soft way she told him to dream bigger than the small town they lived in. And then he remembered something he had pushed away for years, the savings account she left in his name. It wasn't a fortune, but it was hers. Money she had worked for, money she wanted him to have when he was old enough. Ethan had never touched it, partly out of guilt, partly because he didn't feel he deserved it. Every time he thought of it, he pictured her smile and felt like spending it would mean letting her go completely. But now, lying in the dark, he realized holding on to it hadn't protected her memory. It had just kept him stuck. That account wasn't a weight. It was a gift, a lifeline she had left behind because she believed he had a future worth supporting. For the first time, Ethan didn't see it as money locked away. He saw it as her way of telling him to start. The thought steadied him. He didn't need to stay in Caleb's living room forever. He didn't need to keep proving himself to people who would never see him. He could take that money and build a different life. And as sleep finally pulled him under, Ethan knew he had made a decision he couldn't turn back from. He would use what his mother left him, not just to survive, but to create a life no one could call useless again. Ethan left without telling anyone where he was going. With the small savings from his mother and a quiet determination, he took a bus that carried him 2 states away. The ride was long, the scenery shifting from familiar highways to roads he had never seen before. When he finally stepped off in a small town he didn't know, he felt nervous but also strangely light. Nobody here knew him. Nobody had judged him before he spoke. It was a clean start. The first weeks were hard. He found work on a construction crew, waking before dawn and spending long hours carrying heavy beams, mixing cement, and sweating under the sun. His hands blistered, his back ached, but he never complained. The pain reminded him that he was moving forward, that every hour meant money saved towards something better. When the day ended and the other men went home to rest, Ethan stayed awake, taking small repair jobs in a local garage. He had always liked working on cars, and the owner was glad to pay cash for someone who didn't mind getting dirty. Days turned into months. Ethan's routine was grueling, but he didn't let himself slow down. The bitterness from Marjorie's words stayed in the back of his mind like a flame that refused to burn. Every time he thought about quitting, he remembered her face at that dinner table, the way she had spoken to him as if he had no value. That memory pushed him to work harder, to keep going even when his body begged for rest. He lived cheap. His apartment was a single room with thin walls and a mattress on the floor. He cooked simple meals, rice, beans, eggs, and avoided spending on anything that wasn't necessary. Every paycheck went into savings, carefully set aside for the future he was building. Some nights, when exhaustion made his vision blur, he wondered if it was worth it. But then he thought of what it would mean to finally stand on his own and prove he wasn't what Marjorie had called him. That was enough to push through the doubt. After a couple of years, the pieces began to come together. Ethan had saved more than he thought possible. He had also built a reputation at the garage for being reliable, skilled, and honest. Customers started asking for him directly, and soon he realized he could take the leap he had been planning quietly all along. He reached out to Caleb, who had never stopped checking in on him. Together, they pooled what they had and found a small, worn-down shop for sale on the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at, peeling paint, cracked windows, oil stains that never seemed to wash out. But to Ethan, it felt like the start of everything. With Caleb by his side, he cleaned it, repaired the equipment, and painted the sign himself. When the doors opened for the first time, he stood in front of that shop and felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building. Each customer who drove away satisfied, each paycheck earned with his own hands, reminded him that he was capable. For the first time, he didn't measure himself against the cruel words of his stepmother or the silence of his father. For the first time, he believed he was enough. Years passed, and life in the small town became routine for Ethan. The shop grew slowly, his skills and reputation bringing in more customers, and he finally felt a sense of stability he had never known at home. But despite the work, he never completely forgot the house he had left behind, the stepmother who had crushed him, or the father who had stayed silent all those years. One evening, as Ethan was closing the shop, his phone rang. The name on the screen made his chest tighten: Gerald. His father. He hadn't called in years, not since Ethan left. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if he should answer, but he pressed the phone to his ear. "Ethan." Gerald's voice came through, thin and shaky, almost unrecognizable. There was none of the strength Ethan remembered from his childhood. Instead, it sounded like the weight of years had finally broken him. I don't know how to say this," Gerald continued, his words trembling. "They're falling apart here." Ethan listened quietly as his father explained. Travis, who had always been spoiled, had wasted nearly everything he could get his hands on. Cars, trips, credit cards. He had spent recklessly, leaving debts behind like a trail of broken promises. And Marjorie, who had controlled every aspect of the household for so long, had mismanaged accounts, draining the savings and leaving bills unpaid. The house they had lived in for decades, the same house Ethan had once called home, was now on the verge of foreclosure. Gerald's voice caught, and for the first time, Ethan heard something he hadn't expected: regret. I should have stood up for you, son," he whispered. The words were heavy, full of guilt and sorrow. "I thought I was protecting the family, keeping peace, but I failed you. I see that now." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch between them. He remembered all the years of feeling invisible, of being pushed aside, of hearing his father's quiet acceptance while Marjorie tore him down. And yet, hearing Gerald speak those words now, he felt something shift inside him. The anger didn't vanish, but there was a chance for something different, an acknowledgement of wrongs, finally spoken aloud. His father's weakness on the phone made Ethan realize how fragile the life they had built around Marjorie's control really was. The illusions of strength, the carefully maintained appearances, were crumbling, leaving Gerald exposed and alone. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the people who had hurt him most were now facing consequences of their own making. Ethan stayed on the line longer than necessary, listening, weighing the words, thinking about the years he had spent away. There was no rush to forgive, but he could feel the first threads of a new reality form, one where he could step back into their lives on his terms. When Gerald finally said, "I just wanted you to know, son, I see it now," Ethan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He wasn't the powerless boy anymore. He had built something of his own, survived the bitterness, and now he held the power to decide what role, if any, this broken family would have in his life. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove back to his hometown. The roads were familiar, yet the town looked smaller somehow, as if time had shrunk it while he was away. He didn't turn the car toward the familiar streets at first. He wanted to see the changes from a distance, to measure what had become of the life he had left behind. When he finally reached the house, the sight stopped him. The once pristine home that had always seemed untouchable under Marjorie's control now looked worn and neglected. The paint was peeling in corners, the lawn was overgrown, and the driveway held cracks that hadn't been there before. Marjorie's arrogance, once so visible in the perfect curtains and polished floors, seemed to have cracked along with the house. It wasn't hidden by wealth or control anymore. Everything was unraveling in plain sight. Ethan didn't rush to the door. He parked down the street and watched quietly, taking it all in. He saw Travis stepping out of the house to grab the mail. The boy, or the man, he realized, though uncomfortably, looked defeated. His clothes were worn, his hair messy, and he moved with a caution that suggested shame. Travis glanced in Ethan's direction, eyes widening slightly, then quickly looked away. He avoided Ethan completely, a mix of embarrassment and recognition evident in every step he took. The boy who had mocked him for years now seemed small, lost, and broken. Marjorie appeared at the door soon after, a sharp word for Travis as she gestured toward him. Ethan could see her frustration, her hands shaking slightly as she muttered complaints about bills, repairs, and neighbors. She still tried to carry herself with authority, but it was forced, brittle. Ethan realized she was no longer the untouchable figure who had dominated his childhood. The air of superiority she once wore so easily was gone, replaced by the weight of failure and desperation. Ethan didn't need to speak or enter the house to make an impact. He stayed in his car, silently observing, letting the scene unfold. Each frustrated gesture, each hurried movement, each glance of shame directed at him carried more weight than words ever could. The silence he maintained became louder than any confrontation. He didn't have to prove himself with speeches or displays. His success, his independence, and the calm in his presence were enough to unsettle the household. He thought about the years he had spent building something of his own, the sweat and exhaustion, the nights of doubt and struggle. Every moment had led to this point, standing at a distance, witnessing the reversal of roles without interfering. The irony wasn't lost on him. Marjorie, who had once dismissed him as worthless, was now struggling to keep her household intact, and Travis, who had looked down on him, now avoided him out of embarrassment. Ethan finally started the car again, slowly driving away. He didn't feel triumph in the way he expected. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had risen above their control. He didn't need to flaunt his life yet. The simple act of being a part, of having chosen his own path, was enough. He had returned not as the boy they had underestimated, but as a man who had proven, without words, that he was capable, worthy, and free. The dinner was tense from the moment Ethan walked in. The familiar smell of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes filled the room, but it no longer carried warmth. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, as if she could command respect just by sitting there. Travis hovered near her side, fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable. Gerald sat quietly, glancing at Ethan from time to time, his eyes full of something unspoken. Marjorie was the first to break the silence. She leaned back in her chair, a forced smile on her lips, and said, "Well, look who crawled back." Her words carried the same sharp edge as years ago, but this time, Ethan didn't flinch. He held her gaze calmly, letting the comment hang in the air without reacting. Instead of answering her, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded business card. He placed it gently on the table in front of her. "I own 3 auto repair shops now," he said quietly, his voice steady, almost serene. He didn't boast or raise his voice. He simply stated the fact, letting the reality speak for itself. The room grew silent. Travis's eyes widened, Marjorie's lips tightened, and Gerald looked at him with a mix of pride and sorrow. Ethan watched Marjorie's face carefully. She tried to mask the surprise, tried to maintain control, but her confidence faltered. The arrogance that had once seemed untouchable cracked under the weight of truth. Ethan didn't need to say more. The card, the shops, and the calm in his demeanor told the story better than words ever could. Then he reminded her of something she had said years ago, the words that had haunted him through long nights of struggle. "Stay home, you useless." He didn't shout or sneer. He simply said it, letting the memory of her cruelty settle on the table. Then, in the same calm tone, he added, "Turns out leaving was the best thing I ever did." Gerald, who had been quiet all evening, wiped at his eyes. The tears were not loud, but they carried years of regret and acknowledgement. He looked at Ethan with a mixture of pride and sorrow, understanding finally the strength it had taken for his son to survive and build a life on his own. Travis shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, and Marjorie's cheeks flushed. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her usual confidence, her ability to command the room, had vanished. The humiliation was subtle but complete. She had underestimated Ethan for too long, and now the truth was undeniable. Ethan didn't wait for a response. He simply sat back, hands on his lap, calm and composed. The silence he maintained was heavier than any argument. It carried the weight of years of struggle, of growth, and of quiet triumph. No one at the table could deny that he had changed. He had left the house as a boy who had been dismissed, humiliated, and belittled, and he had returned as a man who had built a life of his own. For the first time, Marjorie faced the reality that she no longer had control over him. Gerald felt the pain of past mistakes, and Travis understood, at last, that Ethan was no longer the powerless boy he had mocked. The dinner ended not with shouting or confrontation, but with a quiet acknowledgement of who Ethan had become. After dinner, Gerald pulled Ethan aside in the quiet of the living room. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "Ethan, I don't know what to do," he admitted. "The house, we could lose it. I need your help to save it." Ethan listened without interrupting. He could see the worry etched into his father's face, the years of quiet suffering finally catching up with him. He understood why Gerald was asking. The house had been their family home for decades, a place that had carried memories, both good and bad. But the thought of helping Marjorie, the woman who had spent years tearing him down, filled Ethan with a clear resolve. "I won't help her," Ethan said calmly. His words were firm, but not angry. "Not because I want to hurt you, Dad, but because she doesn't deserve it. She's spent years trying to make me feel worthless, and I won't give her another chance to control anything in my life." Gerald's eyes widened, a mixture of relief and concern crossing his face. "Ethan, I don't know if I can leave her," he said quietly. "After all these years." Ethan shook his head. "It's not too late, Dad. You can still make a choice. I'll help you if you walk away from her, if you finally put yourself and your life first. But I won't waste a single dollar on the person who spent years destroying me and trying to ruin everything I cared about. I've built my own life, Dad. I've survived. I've earned what I have, and I won't let her take any part of it, ever." For a long moment, Gerald didn't speak. He stared at his wife, who had remained in the other room, unaware of the conversation unfolding. For the first time, he seemed to see Marjorie clearly, without the filter of fear or habit. Her influence over him, which had always seemed so absolute, now appeared fragile, empty, and unworthy of loyalty. Finally, he looked back at Ethan, his eyes heavy with years of regret. "You're right," he said softly. "I've let her control too much for too long. Maybe it's time I put myself first, for once." Ethan nodded. He didn't feel triumphant or vengeful. This wasn't about punishment. It was about clarity, about finally drawing the line between those who deserved his care and those who didn't. "It's your choice, Dad," he said. "I'll support you if you make it, but nothing else." That night, Gerald confronted the reality he had avoided for years. He realized he could no longer protect Marjorie, simply out of habit or fear. For the first time, he looked at her and didn't step in to defend her, didn't excuse her behavior, didn't cover up the truth. The balance had shifted. Ethan watched quietly from the other room, knowing he had done the right thing. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply protecting the life he had built, the future he had worked so hard for, and the father who had finally begun to see clearly. The house would no longer be a prison of control and fear. Gerald had a choice, and for the first time in years, that choice didn't include protecting the person who had caused so much pain. Ethan's decision wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom, clarity, and finally setting boundaries that could not be crossed again. Months passed quietly after Ethan's confrontation with his father. Gerald made the difficult choice, leaving Marjorie behind and stepping into a life free from her control. The transition wasn't easy. He had grown used to her dominance. But each day, he felt lighter, more himself, and slowly, confidence returned. He began helping around Ethan's shop, learning quickly, laughing more, and reconnecting with the son he had neglected for years. Meanwhile, Marjorie and Travis faced the consequences of their choices. The house, once carefully maintained under her control, was lost to foreclosure. They moved into a small, cramped apartment that offered none of the comfort or status they had taken for granted. Travis, once cocky and careless, now understood the weight of responsibility. Money was tight, bills piled up, and the smugness that had defined him for years disappeared under the pressure of real life. Marjorie, stripped of her power and influence, no longer commanded anyone's attention or respect. The arrogance she carried so effortlessly was gone, replaced with frustration and denial. Ethan didn't gloat over their downfall. He didn't flaunt his success or taunt them about their losses. His satisfaction wasn't in their suffering. It was in knowing he had survived, built a life of his own, and maintained his dignity. His revenge was simple. He had proven, through quiet perseverance and hard work, that their attempts to diminish him had failed completely. He was respected in the town, successful in his business, and free of the poison that had dominated his past. One evening, Ethan prepared a dinner at his own home. The table was set simply but warmly, a contrast to the tension-filled meals he had endured in the past. Gerald joined him, smiling in a way Ethan had rarely seen. Caleb was there too, making jokes and keeping the atmosphere light. The three of them sat together, enjoying the food, the conversation, and the ease of a life free from fear and resentment. Ethan watched his father laugh, saw the lines of worry soften on his face. He remembered how Gerald had once been silent during Marjorie's cruelty, how he had allowed years of neglect and favoritism to go unchallenged. Now, Gerald's presence at his table was proof of change, of redemption, and of the bonds that could be rebuilt when honesty and courage replaced fear. The room was filled with the kind of laughter Ethan had never thought possible at home. Caleb's humor lightened the mood, and Gerald joined in without hesitation. For the first time, dinner didn't carry tension, judgment, or resentment. It was just a meal among people who cared, who respected one another, and who had chosen a different path. Ethan felt a quiet pride. This was his revenge, not destruction or humiliation, but life well lived, family restored in the way that mattered, and peace reclaimed. He had walked away years ago from a home that made him feel worthless, worked tirelessly to build a better future, and now he could share that success and happiness with the people who truly mattered. As he looked across the table at Gerald and Caleb, he realized that the past's pain had been replaced with something stronger. Love, respect, and laughter had returned, untainted by Marjorie's shadow. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt fully victorious, not through cruelty, but through living well, and that was the ultimate revenge.